Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Nubia Willman, and I am a senior member of the Mayor's Community Engagement Team, and I'm the Director for the Office of New Americans. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Si usted está con nosotros hoy esta noche, tenemos subtítulos en español. El número ahorita en la pantalla, estamos teniendo un problema técnica, pero vamos a poder tener subtítulos en español en el futuro si no podemos arreglar el problemita, pero danos un segundo, gracias. Pero gracias por estar aquí con nosotros para esta tarde para aprender más sobre el presupuesto de 2021. Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. As I just mentioned, we are having a bit of a technical difficulty with the number on the screen, but we are offering subtitles in both English and Spanish, and we were hoping to offer this in Spanish with subtitles later on as well. We're also providing closed caption and have ASL interpreters with us this evening. Today, you will hear from Budget Director Susie Park, who will provide an overview of the proposed 2021 budget. This is part of our continued efforts to engage and inform the community to help us all understand what is in the proposed budget. Over the past couple of months, we have heard from thousands of Chicagoans about your desires and preferences for Chicago's 2021 budget through the budget survey, budget ambassador listening sessions, our town halls, and community conversations. Thank you for all of your work. Your feedback was critical to Mayor Lightfoot as she made difficult decisions about a budget complicated by COVID-19 pandemic. And in the spirit of transparency, we are here tonight to tell you more about Mayor Lightfoot's budget plan and answer your questions. These questions were submitted by the community prior to this event. If this presentation raises any questions, please leave them in the chat, and we will follow up with more information after the meeting. Now, I'm happy to introduce Budget Director Park. Do you want to kick us off with an overview of the 2021 budget?
Thank you, Nubia. Before I begin, I want to let everyone know that the full 2021 budget recommendations and the summary two-pager I am about to go through can be found on the city's website at chicago.gov/budget documents. So, before I begin, let's start by quickly going through the budget process. What you see on the screen here, in July through August, we begin work with our departments in really determining what the need is going to be for 2021 or for the next year. From August through September, we work through our budget forecast, which is published at the end of August, which releases the gap that we are trying to close for the upcoming budget year. We begin our community engagement around our budget process, so our budget town halls, and then we work towards balancing the budget. In October, the mayor submits the budget recommendations to City Council, and throughout November and December, the Committee on the Budget holds budget hearings, and City Council approves the budget by December 31st. And then the annual appropriation goes into effect on January 1st of the next year. Back in August, the city released the 2021 budget forecast, which projects the anticipated expenditures and revenues for the coming budget year. The 2021 budget forecast projected a $1.2 billion gap, the largest in the city's history. More than 65% of this gap, or $783 million, is revenue loss directly caused by the economic impacts of the pandemic. $421.3 million was caused by expected increases to city expenses such as personnel, pension, and debt. Following the release of the budget forecast and gap for 2021, and even amidst an unprecedented pandemic, Mayor Lori Lightfoot made a commitment to be honest and transparent about the financial challenges that we faced. As part of that transparency, the Office of Budget and Management began the 2021 budget development process with a public engagement phase that included Budget Week, a week-long series of virtual budget town hall meetings that were live-streamed on Facebook. The city also introduced the Community Roundtable series, a grassroots effort to gather community feedback from residents on their budgetary priorities. For the second year in a row, the city also launched an online survey which asked participants about city services they most value. Last week, on October 21st, the mayor introduced the 2021 budget recommendations. Let's go through the investments and the steps we took to close the budget gap. Throughout the community engagement process, one of the messages heard loudest from our residents was that investments in neighborhoods continue to be of critical importance, including affordable housing, violence prevention, mental health, and addressing homelessness. These shared values became even more important during the pandemic. Investments made in the 2021 budget include $7 million for economic recovery from the pandemic, an additional $5.25 million in violence prevention, bringing the total corporate violence prevention investment to $16.5 million for 2021. Sustaining the additional $10 million in investment in affordable housing and homelessness made in 2020, as well as adding $2 million for the Renew Woodlawn initiatives that support the Woodlawn Housing Ordinance passed in 2020. And lastly, an additional $1.7 million in youth investments, bringing the total investment to $36.4 million for 2021. This includes support for the My Shy, My Future initiative, the Mayor's Youth Commission, and summer youth employment programs. While investments in our communities remained a priority, we were also facing a $1.2 billion budget gap. To close this gap, we identified more than $537 million in savings and efficiencies, nearly $185 million in additional revenue and use of our reserves, and $501 million in refinancing. Throughout the budget process, the city has been identifying structural efficiencies that maximize existing resources while creating cost savings and improvements to our services. We found more than $106 million in personnel reductions, and we achieved this by reducing vacancies across departments by 1,921 in the corporate fund, including transitioning the crossing guard program to Chicago Public Schools to better align functions between the city and our sister agencies. We also reduced Chicago Police Department vacancies, representing 32% of our total reductions at 614 fewer positions in the 2021 budget. We found $262.6 million in savings from improved fiscal management. Some examples of this includes $59 million from sweeping aging revenue accounts, $68 million from improved revenue and enhanced public safety enforcement, including our speed cameras, and $10 million for continued work around the city's accounts receivables. Another $168.3 million in savings was identified through several city efficiencies, which include nearly $90 million in department non-personnel savings, $25 million from the new Office of Contract Review and Audit, which will be focusing on identifying savings across the city's contracts, and $54 million in healthcare savings. In addition to savings and efficiencies, the city is including in the 2021 budget a debt refinancing and restructuring. As previously mentioned, 65% of the city's budget gap is created by impacts to the city's revenue from the pandemic. This refinancing is intended to address the portion of the gap caused by COVID-19, which is not part of the structural gap. Finally, the increased revenues resulted in a total increase of $184.9 million for 2021. Some examples here include $30 million from our rainy day fund, which is a portion of the city's reserves, $33.5 million in additional TIF surplus, with a total TIF surplus to the city of $76 million, $51.4 million in increased property tax revenue, and $25 million in increases to existing tax revenues. Of the $25 million of increases to existing taxes, $15 million is expected from a 1.75% increase to the cloud tax, and another $10 million is anticipated from a 3-cent increase to the city's vehicle fuel tax. What this means is for a 12-gallon gas tank, this would be an increase to the consumer of about 36 cents per tank. Now, let's spend a few minutes talking about the proposed property tax increase. For the greater part of 2 decades, the City of Chicago's property tax levy was not increased, resulting in annual property taxes that did not proportionately grow with the city's economy. This changed when the property tax increase in 2015 was implemented in order to address the city's steeply growing pension obligations, also a result of decades of underfunding all 4 of the city's pension funds. In an effort to avoid another sudden, large property tax increase, the city is proposing to add a consumer price index, also called the CPI, increase to begin with the 2021 levy and for each year thereafter. For 2021, the CPI increase was calculated utilizing the December 2018 to December 2019 CPI rate of 2.3%, resulting in an increase of $35.4 million. As previously mentioned, the city is also addressing the property tax loss of collections as part of this budget. Each year, the City Council passes an ordinance that levies the amount of property taxes needed for various specified purposes, including levies for each of the city's 4 pension funds. Annual contributions to the pension funds have historically been made primarily from the proceeds of these property tax levies. When the county collects the levied amount, there's a portion that is not collected each year, whether due to late payments or no payments at all. This results in non-collection of the full levy or a collection of a portion of the levy in a future year. Changes to state law in 2016 requires the full payment of what was levied to be paid to the pension funds at the time it was levied. What this means is that the city must make up the difference between what is levied and what is collected. To this end, the proposed 2021 budget includes an increase to the property tax levy in the amount of $42.5 million to account for this loss of collections. The proposed increases to the 2021 property tax levy would result in a total increase of $93.9 million. This includes the increase to account for loss of collections, the CPI, and $16 million for new property coming online that does not impact the taxes paid on existing properties. Keep in mind that increasing the 2021 property tax levy means that our residents will see this in their 2022 tax bill. For the median home value of $250,000, the average estimated impact of this increase is approximately $56 per year. We worked very hard with our departments and with our many stakeholders to both identify as many savings and efficiencies as possible, as well as to find structural solutions for the portion of our gap. Of the solutions I just discussed, close to 50% are structural solutions, which means that they will help balance our budget beyond just 2021. Thank you for allowing me a few minutes to go over our 2021 budget, and now I'll turn this back to Nubia for some questions.
Thank you so much for that overview, Budget Director. Let's go through some questions that we received regarding the budget. As a reminder, we received these prior to this meeting, and if you do have any follow-up questions, you can leave them in the chat and we will be able to follow up with you. Our first question asks, how many city or park district or school employees were laid off since March 15th, 2020 due to their jobs becoming obsolete because of COVID?
Thank you for that question, Nubia. So let's take this in parts. For the city, we have not laid off any employees in 2020. In terms of the park district or school employees, I do want to remind everyone that the city budget that we're talking about today is different and does not include our sister agencies, which includes the park district, the Chicago Public Schools, CTA or city colleges, or the Chicago Housing Authority. Each of those are separate, what we consider sister agencies, but they're separate bodies that have their own budget and approval process. And so, that is not a part of what we're talking about when we talk about the 2021 budget.
Very good to know. Our next question is, how were budget decisions made? What impact did community input have on decision making?
That's a great question. So, there's a lot that goes into budget decisions. There's a lot of people that we speak with, a lot of stakeholders involved in kind of putting this budget together. We've heard a lot of the feedback from all of the engagement and outreach that we did. We work with members of the City Council. We worked with all of our department heads to really understand, what impact certain decisions may make, both, with personnel and non-personnel, what impact it has on services. And then the other piece of it is, we have, as part of every budget, statutorily required payments. Whether it's our pensions, whether there's certain required increases, both contractually, that we also have to keep in mind as we develop a budget. So there's a lot of factors that go in, but I do want to say that the community input also played a big role in kind of, as we were making these decisions on, keeping in mind what our residents want and what is important to them.
Thank you. And we're so grateful for all that input as well. Our next question is a little bit long, so bear with me, but why does the 2021 budget not reflect a real and significant reduction in the Chicago Police Department budget? They go on to ask, reducing the CPD budget and rerouting those funds to other needs is what the city is asking for. 87% of the respondents to the recent 2021 budget survey overwhelmingly identified the CPD budget as an area where resources needed to be pulled from. Why does the 2021 budget refuse to respond to that overwhelming feedback?
Thank you for that question. So a couple of things to address this question. One, with a budget gap of $1.2 billion, it wasn't about, taking something from one department and giving it to another. I think, we work with every department to find efficiencies and savings where we can to help close the $1.2 billion gap that we faced. I think the other component of this, and really what I got from the survey, is really the importance of continuing our investments, and not about moving it, from one budget to another, but really continuing our investments, no matter how difficult our budget was, to continue, the investments we made last year in violence prevention. We made investments in homelessness and housing, as well as mental health. And so what this budget did, as we put it together, was ensure that those investments we made last year definitely were continued into 2021. And then in each of those areas, we were able to increase, as we went over in our investments, we were able to add additional funds to that. And adding to that, using the CARES funding that we received this year, we also continue to make investments in those areas. And so we leveraged, all the funding that we had to ensure that, what we heard from our residents was that these types of social services were critical, and we wanted to ensure that we kept those investments going and added to that.
Thank you. Our next question asks, have you considered a tax on streaming services like Netflix?
Great question. I've had this. I've gotten this question before. So the city already receives taxes on streaming services such as Netflix. This is accounted for in our revenues under our amusement tax line and is currently taxed at 9%.
There you go. Our next question is, why did you decide to raise property taxes when it would hurt residents and landlords during a pandemic?
So we've gotten a lot of questions about property taxes, and I know I spent some time in my brief going over, what makes up our property tax increase. Part of what this budget did, and because it was such a large gap, is that we had to balance a variety of solutions to really close that. And as I talked about in how we make budget decisions, I think a lot of that was, how do we balance both, the needs of our residents while still ensuring that we're able to provide these services and close this gap. So, again, before we got to property tax, we worked really hard with our departments and found over $500 million in efficiencies. The other thing that we wanted to work through is ensuring that some of our solutions are structural, so that some of the hard choices and decisions that we're making this year is going to help as we move into next year and the year after and the year after. So anything that we put in place today that's structural is something that will carry over into future years.
Thank you. Another question asks, what departments stand to lose vacancies? How will that impact the delivery of city services, and will those positions disappear altogether?
So, we did a lot of work with vacancies in our departments. Almost all of the departments had some vacancies that we reduced, and a lot of that was due to some of the efficiencies that we found. We worked with our departments on, especially during COVID-19, did they learn better ways to provide services? Were there certain things that maybe now didn't have to be in person? Were there better ways to do certain things that we've been doing for a long time? So as a result of a lot of those conversations, we were able to reduce the number of vacancies and positions across the city. But while we did that, we really very much tried to balance city services. And really try to understand, with the reduction of certain positions, what that meant and the impact it would have, and as much as we could, and really, we tried to ensure that there were no city services that our residents depend on to be impacted through that.
Great. And as we wait for our next round of questions, here we go. Will the election impact the budget?
That's a great question.
Very important question.
Yes, with that coming up next week. So it is hard to tell. How's that? A lot of people have been asking about, what is the impact of potential federal funding? What would happen if it came? One of the things I can tell you is that, the budget that we've presented to the city and to our residents is closing this gap with the current tools that we have. We are required statutorily to pass a budget by the end of the year, by December 31st. The election, federal packages, we don't know yet what that's going to look like. And I know we've heard a lot in the news of different types of packages that potentially may come, but it is not certain. And there's a lot of uncertainty around the timing of when it's going to come, what it looks like, the amount. And so, it may impact, but it will not impact what we have presented to everyone today and what came out in our 2021 recommendations, because we work to close that gap with the tools that we currently have.
Great. So what I'm hearing from that is, regardless, make sure you vote by November 3rd.
Yes, absolutely.
One of our next questions is, can the Virginian cannabis industry help the budget?
So the city has a 3% excise tax on our cannabis sales, which began on July 1st of this year. The 2020 year-end projection for cannabis for the city is anticipated to be about $1.5 to $2 million, and the total amount of revenue that we anticipate for 2021 is about $5.1 million. Now, keep in mind that this is a new revenue source. It's a new industry that had just started this year, so it's going to take a couple years for this to grow. We did not anticipate a lot of revenue coming in our first year, and we did a lot of work looking at other cities such as Denver and other people that went before us that have legalized cannabis, to see kind of what the speed of that growth is. So for next year, we're still anticipating about $5.1 million, and we hope to see that grow into the future.
Very good. Given that this year we are in the middle of a global pandemic, are you just concerned with this year's budget, or are you thinking ahead for the future years?
So this budget was definitely tough, and so we did a lot of work to close this gap. But of course, as we work to close each year, as we work to put the budget together, we always think about what's coming ahead. I talked about structural solutions, so anything that we did that was structural this year will carry over into next year. And one of the things that I know the mayor and my team and the finance team have been working on is to ensure that we are structurally balanced into the future. So what that means is that we want to create enough solutions that will continue to carry the city year over year into the future, so that it's not every year that we're trying to close a $1.2 billion gap. So absolutely, as we work to close this year's gap, a lot of thought went into how does that carry us into the future.
Very good. As we wait for sorry about that. Here's another question. This is from the chat. And can you talk more about the impact to crossing guards being transitioned to CPS?
Yes, thank you for that question. So the impact to crossing guards, there should be none. What we are doing, and this came up with a lot of the discussions we had around, during COVID-19, and, operationally, what CPS does impacts our crossing guards. And so, we do think that it will help operationally, moving the crossing guards to CPS. Now, in terms of for our crossing guards, there should be very little change because, what has been in place in the city is carrying over into CPS.
Very good. Another chat, this is from our budget ambassadors. We were asked about what we thought about reallocation from one department to another. Why isn't this something the city is considering?
So that's a good question. I think, again, what I talked about as for the previous question is that, due to the large gap that we faced this year, it wasn't really about, taking resources from one department and moving it to another. It was, how do we find savings and efficiencies within each department to help close our gap and to really create, more efficiencies within that department while working through other solutions to close that gap.
Another question from the chat, why couldn't you stretch out the property tax increase into further years?
So that's a great question. And I think I did mention, so the 2021 levy that we're proposing to increase actually will not hit our residents until, you will not see that in your tax bill until 2022. So what that means is that even though, we will pass the budget with an increase to the 2021 levy, that means that will be in effect for the 2022 tax bill that you will see 2 years from now.
Very great. Thank you, Susie, for taking time today to talk through the budget plans. It was very informative, and it answered a lot of questions from the residents, especially those watching and interacting. Thank you all for writing in your questions as well. We're grateful we were able to answer some of them. For everyone that's watching, remember that you can learn more about the budget recommendations by visiting the city's website at chicago.gov/budget documents. Please have a good night. Thank you again for joining us, and stay safe.
Thank you.